a terrific American who has the courage to stand up and be lonely, which, believe it or not, is a courage that a President of the United States needs to have. Without further ado, Senator Rand Paul.
Franklin Pierce has a baseball team to brag about. I came in and I said hello to President Carter, and I was telling him, because I knew he was close to the Bush family, I was telling him about one of the first times I ran into the first George Bush, President Bush. I was in Alvin, Texas, and it was about 20 miles away from where I grew up. It was a town of about 20,000 people, and I went to a Chamber of Commerce, and I was in high school at the time. And the first George Bush president was there, and he didn't have anybody with him. He wasn't elected anything. There was no Secret Service or anything. He was beginning to campaign for president, but an older guy got up at the end of it. At the end of the presentation, he had something in his hand. He said, "George Bush, do you know what this is?" He said, "No." He said, "This is a scorecard from the 1941 Yale baseball team, and you're on it, playing first base." And he got George Bush to sign the baseball card. About a year or so ago, and I was telling the President this also, and I thought I'd start and elaborate. I said, if I could avoid talking about the Bushes in front of President Carter, I could just elaborate. Might as well just elaborate. So I had a sit down with George W. Bush, and I asked him this question. I said, do you think your foreign policy changed because of 9/11, or do you think it always would have been what it was going to be regardless of 9/11? Because some people say, well, you know, George Bush ran for office in 2000, said he was going to be for a more humble foreign policy, not really going to believe that nation building was going to work that well. And some people think his foreign policy changed because we were attacked on 9/11. Sounds reasonable. But he was pretty adamant in telling me, no, that his foreign policy was different than his father's foreign policy. That he truly believed that we should spread freedom abroad and that we could take freedom to countries around the world. And I don't dispute or in any way malign George W. Bush's belief that he wanted to do that, or his intentions, or give him bad intentions for doing it, but I do disagree that it's possible. I just don't think that we can spread freedom around the world, that we can take it and all of a sudden we can recreate the rest of America, the rest of the world in America's image. Now what do I mean by that? We went to Iraq and there was a terrible guy there, Saddam Hussein, and we said, well, we're going to get rid of him and we're going to liberate the Iraqi people, and then we're going to have democracy over there, and somehow by spreading freedom it's going to be a better world in the Middle East. I think the president was well-intentioned. I think he still believes that. I think many people in the Republican Party still believe this, but I just don't think it works. Why doesn't it work in the Middle East? We can ask, and I think we can make conjecture why it doesn't work, but I think in order to understand maybe why it doesn't work in the Middle East, we need to understand, why did it work here? Why did we have an American Revolution and all of a sudden we got freedom here? Did it just come out of nothing? Did we replace tyranny with freedom? I think that's too simplistic. I think actually that our freedom was predicated on a long struggle. I mean, a long, long struggle. A big part of, or a turning point in the struggle was actually 1215 at the plains of Runnymede, when the barons gather and say to the king, we're going to take some of your power back. And so when the Magna Carta is written, really that's sort of, I think, the beginning of a modern age. But think about that. That's over 800 years ago. So you have this long tradition in English history of the Parliament, the barons, everybody all trying to restrict the power of the king. And then you get to our country, we threw out the king. But you know what? We didn't really throw out our representative bodies. The House of Burgesses had been meeting since like 1640. So we had over 100, 150 years of local representative democracy. We had English common law, and we had our religious traditions. And our religious traditions, the people that happened to come to our country, were typically people that were trying to get away from religious tyranny or state-sponsored religion that didn't allow you to practice your religion. So we happened to be a collection of a lot of people that were somewhat free-thinking in the sense that they thought we could choose our own religion. We weren't going to have a state religion. So when we break with the king, it isn't this abrupt break where we're trying something completely brand new. I see it as a continuum. So then we look at the Middle East and we say, well, why can't the Middle East have Jeffersonian democracy and Magna Cartas and all of this? Well, they don't quite have the same tradition. Their tradition really has been of despotism and despotism alone. They haven't had sort of the control. They've had one strong man after another. And the thing is that some of it is kind of related to the countries and the way the countries are drawn over there. Look at Iraq. Who drew up Iraq? The Western powers drew up Iraq and Syria and all these countries out there in World War I. But when we drew them, maybe we didn't draw them in exactly the best way to draw a country. We gathered people together sometimes that were in different tribes and didn't like each other. So Iraq really has Shiites, it's got Kurds, and it's got Sunnis. And they've all really been disliking each other for maybe 1,000 years. And so the question is how do they stay together as a country? They've stayed together as a country when they've had an iron fist. Saddam Hussein was that iron fist. Is that a good thing? No, I don't think we should have given any money to Saddam Hussein. We shouldn't give arms to him, although we did some of that for quite a while until we decided we were going to spread freedom and democracy in the Middle East. But then when we did, we got rid of Hussein, what did we get? You know, they didn't really greet us so much as liberators. We had a protracted civil war, and we eventually won with this big surge in 2007. And people say, that's all, you know, if we'd have just stayed, it would be peace forever. The problem is there's a long-standing war there that I'm not sure that we're going to eradicate. You know, the Sunnis and the Shiites have been at war for 1,000 years, almost since Muhammad, the time of Muhammad. Within 40 years after Muhammad, they were fighting with each other. And they're still fighting. And I kind of joke and say, we, you know, were wondering what Lindsay Lohan was wearing last week. They're still arguing and bitter over the massacre at Karbala in like 800 AD. They've got a long memory over there, and it's not going away quickly. And we think, well, why can't they, you know, why don't they greet us as liberators? Why don't they love us? We liberated their country. Why don't they love us? Do you know who Iraq's best ally is right now? Iran. We spent $1 trillion and 5,000 young American men and women died in Iraq, and they look to Iran as their greatest ally now. Who's their second best friend? Russia. Right. So now we have a country that we liberated is close to Iran and Russia. And then the other day, Russia decides to now start flying over there. Who invited them? Iraq said you can fly in our airspace. Syria says you can fly in our airspace. And so now people are saying, well, we should have a no-fly zone over there. Think about what that means. A no-fly zone means you're going to shoot down anybody that flies in that airspace. Well, Russia already flies in that airspace. So does that mean you're ready to declare a war with Russia? We spent 70 years of the Cold War avoiding a confrontation, not being weak, but negotiating from a position of strength, and the Cold War ended without a nuclear calamity. And you had many wise presidents, including the first George Bush, who I think knew better than to think that somehow we were going to transform the world. Now, many of these presidents weren't passive. Reagan was known as someone who stood up to the Russians, stood up to the evils of the Soviet Union. But you know, Reagan wasn't rash, and he wasn't this, I think, immature, bellicose president that sometimes the Democrats painted him to be. He kept open lines of communication with Russia. He spoke with Gorbachev, and he eventually negotiated with Gorbachev. In the primary season now, though, we had people standing on the stage saying they're no longer going to speak with Russia. Think about that. Do we really want to have a president who says we're stopping communication with Russia, we're going to have a no-fly zone in an area of about 50 miles of airspace, and we're not going to talk to Russia about where they're flying or where we're flying? That's a recipe for disaster. We have to think about and ask ourselves, while it sounds noble that we are going to spread freedom and democracy everywhere, does it work? Think about the regime change in Libya. Who was for it? And this is important because they're trying to paint themselves as being on opposite sides, but in reality, many of these people are on the same side. Obama was for it, so was Hillary Clinton, so was Marco Rubio, and so were many of the other Republicans. They say, regime change, we're going to spread freedom. In fact, we have one senator who says, these are freedom fighters. Hillary Clinton said, we don't need guns in Libya. We don't need to have our ambassador have people walking around him with weapons because these are freedom fighters. And the Libyan freedom fighters will be insulted to see our people carry weapons. So let's not have too many guns around the ambassador in Benghazi. Didn't work out so well. Libya is now considered to be a failed state. Means there's no government in Libya anymore. A third of Libya pledges allegiance to ISIS. So you have to ask yourself, was it a good idea to have regime change? Hillary Clinton still argues for it. Marco Rubio still argues for it. They say regime change is the way to go. Now they would say, if they were here in their defense, they would say, well, we just didn't stay long enough, we didn't put enough troops in. But are we willing to do that? Are we willing to take out regimes around the world and then put 500,000 troops in or 1 million troops in and say, we're just going to stay until finally you guys accept Western democracy? I just don't think it works. The same goes in Syria. In 2013, they came to my committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, and they said, we want arms for the moderate Syrians. And one CIA analyst wrote about this, and he said, you know what, the only thing moderate about these Islamic rebels in Syria is their ability to fight. So what we did is we poured weapons into these so-called moderate Syrians, but you know who ended up with the weapons? ISIS. They simply took them away from weaker fighters. Do you know we spent $250 million in the last year? I can't believe we have people running our government doing this. We spent $250 million to train 60 fighters. $4 million per fighter, and then some genius, we won't name him, who lives in the White House apparently, decided that they would send 4 of them, no, 5. He sent 5 people to war. Who the hell sends 5 people to war? They were captured in 10 minutes. Cost $4 million per fighter to train them. We gave them tens of millions of tanks and armored vehicles. They rode into Syria and they were captured. But you know who they were captured by? Al-Nusra. Who is Al-Nusra? Well, they're a jihadist group, but they're supposedly our allies. They captured our people anyway, took all our equipment. I don't know what happened to the soldiers, but here's the point. You have people, everybody loves General Petraeus. They bring him to Washington, you know what he says? We need to ally with Al-Qaeda. If we could just ally with Al-Qaeda against ISIS, we could beat ISIS. You know what they told us a while back? They said, we can beat the Russians if we ally with Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen. It hasn't seemed to work very well to ally with radical Islam, hoping that somehow we're going to get something better when radical Islam takes over. So Al-Nusra is a radical Islamist group, but we have been their allies. This is completely insane. When this came before my committee, I said the ultimate irony here is, the irony you will have to explain is that one day we will have to go back to fight against our own weapons. I told them this in 2013. Now everybody says we've got to do something about ISIS. ISIS rides around in $1 billion worth of U.S. Humvees. They have $1 billion in U.S. cash. They pay their soldiers with your money. They have our tanks. They have our anti-tank weapons. The anti-tank weapons we actually gave to some group, and I can't remember the name of them, one of the 1,500 groups in the Syrian Civil War. And at the time we gave them the anti-tank weapons, they said, you know what, when we're done with Assad, we're going back to take the Golan Heights back. And so I raised my hand and I said, how many of the 1,500 groups in Syria fighting against Assad would recognize our ally Israel? 0. They all hate Israel. So Israel's our ally, and we're going to arm the enemies of Israel. That's who these people are. And people say, well, Assad is terrible. We've got to get rid of Assad. Well, yeah, but sometimes there's variations of evil on both sides of the war. I wouldn't give money to Assad. I wouldn't give arms to Assad. I wouldn't do anything for Assad. But I'm not so sure dislodging Assad will make America safer. So if your goal is to spread democracy and freedom, you say, Assad is against that. We get rid of Assad and there'll be democracy and freedom. Maybe. Or maybe you get rid of Assad and you get the tyranny of ISIS. And perhaps as we pushed Assad back in that civil war, a space developed in that space ISIS grew. See, this has happened time and time again. Maybe it's not so easy to spread freedom and democracy. Maybe in trying to spread freedom and democracy, we're toppling stability and getting instability. I would argue that we are less safe as a people with Gaddafi gone. With Gaddafi gone, you have a failed state. They will be training terrorists in Libya. And the other side will say, well, we just didn't stay long or leave enough troops. We've got to leave more troops. If you want to see a fix for this, and see, this is the big debate now. President Obama wants to send 50 people in, okay? The dumbest thing, you don't go to war with 50 people. You don't go to war with 5 people. But the people on our side who want to go back to war in Iraq and think we've got to have American troops on the ground, you know how many people they're calling for? 10,000. Well, 10,000 is not enough either. You know, we had about 50,000 when we had the surge. We had another 50,000 of support. You want to beat ISIS? All right, go to war. Send your sons and daughters back there, but you need 500,000. Send them all in. We'll wipe ISIS out in 6 months. But you know what happens? They'll slither away, and they'll regroup. They'll change their name, and within a couple of years they come back. Why? Because it's an ideology. The ideology of radical Islam is not going away until civilized Islam steps forward and says, this does not represent our religion. Now, does that mean we should just stay behind our oceans and do nothing and retreat and be isolationist and build a wall around the United States? No, I think we can help those who want to defeat ISIS. I think we can amplify those who are in the region who want to. The Kurds are a lot different than the Syrian rebels. Why? Because they have a homeland, and they've had this homeland for hundreds of years. Under the Ottoman Empire, there was a Kurdistan. So they have been a group of people. They self-associate, and they associate with their land, and they will fight. So I would supply them with arms. Where I wouldn't have given the Syrian rebels a gun, I would supply the Kurds directly. We don't do any of that. We didn't do it under the Bush regime, and we don't do it under Obama because they made the decision that the new government in Baghdad is going to get the weapons. Well, the new government in Baghdad pushed all the Sunnis out. They don't associate with the Kurds either. They're a Shiite government. The army is almost entirely Shiite, and the problem is it's seen as sectarian. So all these Sunni villages where ISIS is, they have to decide who do we hate worse. ISIS coming in or the Shiites. And to tell you the truth, ISIS that's coming in says a lot of things that they agree with. They're Sunni Muslims, and they say we're devout Sunni Muslims. By the time they come in and take over your country and start cutting heads off, it's too late. But those people will rise up. And the one thing I do agree with is in the surge, when we won the surge, ultimately the Sunni villagers became part of it, and the Sunni chieftains did. Now some money helped a little bit along the way. But ultimately, the only victory that will be a long-lasting victory in the Middle East will not come from Americans. If the people on the ground look like us and they're Christians, what will they say? The Crusades have come again, and they will recruit 10,000 more because they hate the idea of Christians being in their land. This was the whole thing with bin Laden. He hated having troops in his land. It was probably not a good idea, and even those in our administration admitted finally having troops in Saudi Arabia was not a great idea. We finally took them out. We have to defend ourselves. We have to decide how to defend ourselves. We have to decide how are we best able to try to control the spread of this virus and this disease. One way I think we ought to defend ourselves is controlling who comes to the country. And I think we have to have a border and we ought to have rules. 9/11, 19 hijackers came here. How did they come here?
Through Jeddah, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, with a visa. They all came here legally. All 19 came here legally, but were they honest with us? And did we look at their visas and make sure they were being honest with us? No, we didn't do a darn thing. And do we do anything about visas now for people coming here? We don't monitor them all. We have 11 million people in the country illegally. 40% of them have overstayed their visa. So they came here legally, and then they overstayed their visa. 40% of the 11 million came in legally, but then we have no idea who they are, where they are, we don't care. We have no immigration law. And this has been going on for 20, 30 years. Nobody, Republican or Democrat, has enforced the laws that we have. One of the hijackers came in, we caught him before 9/11, Massaoui. He was from France. He came in on what's called a visa waiver. It means that anywhere in Europe, you can come and visit our country with no visa. You can come for 90 days like this. The French attackers that just killed and massacred people in Paris, all of them French citizens, and all of them could have hopped on a plane and come here. Unless they were on the watch list, and probably some of them were on the watch list. But French citizens can come here without a visa. You say, well, France is an ally. That's right. But even though they're an ally, doesn't mean we can just have an open border with France. France has an enormous problem down with radical Islam. Germany's got one, and they're importing even a bigger problem now. England's got the same problem. Do I want to cut off trade and say, no, we shouldn't have travel? No, let's have lots of travel. But can't we just say if you're coming to visit, you're going to go through global entry? It's like the frequent flyer program. If you want less scrutiny and less hassle at our airports, you can get in a frequent flyer program. And it is a lot better. Global entry would be the same way. You want to visit us from France, get in global entry. There are a lot of legitimate businessmen and women. You could apply to the Middle East. It just needs to be expanded to the Middle East also. But until we fix it, I think we ought to slow down what we're doing. The other debate in our country is, people say we cannot be safe from terrorists unless we collect all of your phone data and all of your credit card data. So for about a decade, we have collected all of your phone records. We have collected, and we still do collect, 95% of your credit card records. That wasn't even part of this debate. But think about what we can tell about you. If I have your credit card record, what can I tell about you? I can tell whether you drink, I can tell whether you smoke, I can tell what you read, I can tell who your doctors are, I can tell what your medicines are. Even through phone data, just how long your phone calls are, 85% of the time they can tell your religion from your phone calls. Nearly 100% of the time they can tell your doctors are. Almost every doctor's phone number is in the white pages or the yellow pages, and all we have to do is look up and we have the record of the phone number and the duration. They can tell what procedures you're contemplating. They can tell a lot about your personal life from your phone data. In fact, one former head of the NSA said that we kill people based on metadata. That's a little bit worrisome. And I think he's talking about other people outside of the country, but the thing is that we kill people based on metadata should lend you to believe that they think they know a lot about you from your metadata. Now the government says we're not reading your records, we're not listening to your phone calls. That may well be true, but the people who are telling you this are the same people who denied that the program existed. All right? James Clapper's head of the intelligence for the country. He comes before the Senate, and Ron Wyden, the senator from Oregon, says, "Are you collecting all the records of Americans?" And he says, "No." This to me is a significant problem. We cannot have the intelligence agencies lying to Congress. It's against the law. It's perjury, and he should have gone to jail for it. Instead, he still works for the president. But we have so much power we've given to the intelligence agencies. They say they're not listening to our phone conversations, but how are we to believe them when they lied to us about the program existing in the beginning? So I think we have to be concerned about this. Now let's say they're not listening or reading any of your mail or doing any of that or looking at your email. Let's say they're not. Is the act of just collecting your records an invasion of your privacy?
Yes.
Here's the analogy I think of. The British soldiers, our objection, the reason we wrote the Fourth Amendment is the king was giving British soldiers the power to write a warrant and to go into anyone's house. It was called a general warrant or writ of assistance, and we greatly objected to it. Would we have been okay if the British soldiers came in and said, "We're here to get your papers, but we're not going to read them"? That's what's happening now. They're collecting all your records, and your records are no longer in your house. In fact, I could almost care less if the government comes in my house looking for my papers. I have no papers. But my phone has my world on it. It has everything that I talk about, all of my communications, all of my financial transactions, everything about a person's on their phone now. And so the real question, and the court hasn't decided this yet, do your transmissions, do your records, do you have any expectation of privacy? Now the other side will say, once you give them to the bank, you've given up your expectation of privacy. I disagree with that because when I give my money to the bank and they have my records, I have a privacy agreement with them that says they can't tell my neighbor. They've signed an agreement to keep my records private. I think I still have ownership or partial ownership of my records because I've signed an agreement. The same with my internet provider. When you sign all those little agreements, those agreements say that they're not going to share your information. People say, well, we've got to be safe, so we've got to collect them all. So then the next question is, practically, does it work? We've been collecting these records for a decade. At first, the intelligence agency said 52 people had been caught or stopped from terrorism. Well, we questioned them on this, and 2 bipartisan commissions looked at every case. You know how many cases they found were stopped by this? 0. Not one terrorist has been caught by the bulk collection of records. The other thing we need to think about is, there's a guy who won a Nobel Prize by the name of Herbert Simon, and he talked about consumer choice, whether individuals make good choices. And what they discovered is the more information you get, sometimes you're overwhelmed by it. There's a point at which you get too much information and your decision making isn't as good. Malcolm Gladwell put it this way, he said, knowledge does not equate with understanding. You can get so much information that you're overwhelmed by it. And so when people look at me, and this is the debate we have in our primary, people say, oh, well, I don't want, Rand Paul's not going to defend the country because he won't let the government have all the records. I think we're less safe getting all the records because I think they get overwhelmed with the records. And I'm not against getting the records of terrorists. I'll give you an example. The Boston bombers, the Sinarov boys. The Russians said that one of them, at least one of them, they were suspicious that he'd been radicalized. Then he flew back to Chechnya. We didn't even know he flew back to Chechnya because we're not paying enough attention. We don't have enough people monitoring the people for whom we have suspicion, so no one knew he went back. Let's say we have those two items and you've got one other item saying on a public posting, he's communicating something radical. You come to me and I'm an advocate for privacy, and let's say I'm a judge and you ask me, can we look at that boy's records? I'm a hell yes. You look at his records, and if he called 10 people and you give me their names and you say there's something suspicious, some probable cause to make us think, you don't have to prove it. You have to have evidence, and it has to be individualized. I'm fine with that. So I want to look at more records. I just don't want to look at everybody's records in Boston. So if I'm the judge and you come and say, you want to look at Sinarov records, I'm fine. If you say you want to go 100 hops into the data, finding out who he's communicating with, I'm fine. But if you say I want to look at everybody's records in Boston, I'm a no. Because then we're ultimately giving up something that was our founding fathers fought the revolution over. I mean, John Adams said that the spark that led to the revolution was really, James Otis's fight against generalized warrants. So these are the things we think about when we think about what we want in our next leader. Do you think the idea that we can spread freedom and democracy around the world is a good idea? Are you willing to send 500,000, 1 million, whatever it takes? Are you willing to garrison your sons and daughters around the world and pacify the world? Or do you think that national defense should mean defending our country? And I'm not saying it's just here at home, but I mean defending the country where we have to, where there's a national interest, where there's a vital U.S. interest. And this gets glossed over all the time. People say, well, yeah, there's a vital interest. A vital national security interest is a conclusion. The way you get to the conclusion is you have a debate. What did our founding fathers say? They gave that power to Congress, not to the president. In fact, one of the things I liked about President Obama when he ran in 2007 is he said, no president should unilaterally go to war without the authority of Congress, unless we're under imminent attack. That's what the Constitution says. That's what our founding fathers intended. They gave the power to declare war to Congress. They didn't give it to the president. The president was specifically precluded from that. In fact, Madison said that history demonstrates what the Constitution supposes, that the executive branch is most prone to go to war. Therefore, the power to declare war was vested in the legislature. And so as we look at that, the president, a couple years ago, after he had said that, came to one of our small lunches. And we were discussing the war in Libya. And I raised my hand and I quoted the president his quote, and he kind of smiled. He said, oh, people like to quote back to me all kinds of things. And I said, well, what is the answer? What is your justification for going to war in Libya without congressional authority? He says, well, they were under imminent attack. And I said, who? He said, oh, the people who live in Benghazi. Gaddafi was sending tanks to Benghazi. And I was like, you mean to tell me? But even when we have been attacked, almost every good president has come immediately and asked the people for permission through their Congress. When we were attacked by Japan on December 7th, when did FDR come to Congress? December 8th. I saw a thing the other day, they had a speech written out, and he said, it was started out, this day will live in world history, and it had marked out world history, and he had written infamy, a day that will live in infamy. But he asked for permission the day after the attack. When we were attacked on 9/11, it wasn't quite as immediate, but still George Bush came to Congress and we voted on it. It was nearly unanimous. As incompetent and feckless and gridlocked as Congress is, when we're attacked, I think we do come together as a people. But I think we're actually stronger when we vote on it in Congress instead of giving that power to the presidency. When people ask me what's the worst thing the president has done, I say the collapse of the separation of powers. Congress is supposed to be co-equal with the president. But you know what it is now? The president's used 1,000 times more powerful than Congress. If I could do anything as president, it would be to start to bring back the co-equal branches. Madison said we would pit ambition against ambition, and there would be checks and balances. The worst things that are happening in our country are all coming from regulations that the president's passing on his own. He's not passing anything, he's just writing them up. He's got his pen, he's got his phone, he's going to do what he wants. So we've allowed too much power to gravitate to the executive branch. We have to have checks and balances back again. And I'd like to finish with this. I think that if we think about our problems overall as a country, and this plays into a foreign policy that's very expensive as well, is we have to begin to balance our books, spend what comes in. $3 trillion comes in and we spend $3.8 trillion. We borrow $1 million a minute. Whose fault do you think it is? Republicans or Democrats?
Yes.
Both. Yes. The best example of that is about a month ago we raised the debt ceiling. We also busted the budget caps. Who do you think made us do that? Republicans came and said we need more military spending. We have to have more military spending. Marco Rubio wants to borrow $1 trillion for more military spending. That's not conservative. We are not stronger as we go further into debt. But that's on the right. The left came forward and said we want more welfare spending. So the unholy alliance is right and left come together in a secret handshake, and we get more spending on everything. So the debt problem and big government is right and left. So until we get a true fiscal conservative, someone who across the board says we got to hold the line, we are never going to balance the budget. You will be disappointed. You will elect a Republican, and the budget's never going to balance if that Republican is not willing to hold the line, even on military spending. And you'll say, well, gosh, we got to defend ourselves. We spend more on the military than the next 10 countries combined. You add Russia to China and the next 8 countries, and you get to what we spend. I think it should be a priority to defend the country. It has to be done at the federal level. I will always make it a priority, but it can't be a blank check. We should audit the Pentagon. We should audit the Fed. We should audit every last bit of government. But until we get something different, until you decide that you want something different, if we do the same old, what we've been doing, you're going to get the same result. And ultimately, my fear is we're going to destroy the currency, we're going to destroy the country, and it's not going to be a good outcome. We are the greatest country in the history of mankind. We are the richest, we are the freest, we are the most humanitarian country. We give away $400 billion worth of private charity every year. That only happens in a great, rich, capitalistic country. I want to preserve that. I want a government so small I can barely see it, but I want you to have so much freedom and liberty that you make and produce so much stuff that we have enormous wealth that we can then give to others. I hope you'll consider trying something new as we look forward. Thank you very much.